When my sister Claire smiled at me across the table at our favorite brunch spot and asked if she could help me with my wedding planning, I had no idea that 6 months later I would be standing in a police station filing charges against her. My name is Rachel Morrison, I am 32 years old, and I work as a software project manager for a tech startup in Seattle, Washington. This is the story of how my own sister tried to destroy the most important day of my life, and how her actions ultimately destroyed her own carefully constructed world instead. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning everything changed started like any other Saturday in early spring. I was sitting at my dining room table surrounded by wedding binders, fabric swatches, and an open laptop displaying the digital invitation management system I had been meticulously updating for months. My fiancé Marcus had left early for his standing basketball game with college friends, trusting me to handle the final details of our guest list before we sent the invitations to print. The apartment smelled of the fresh coffee I had brewed, and sunlight streamed through the windows overlooking Puget Sound, creating the kind of peaceful atmosphere that made detailed work feel almost enjoyable rather than tedious. Marcus Chen and I had been together for 5 years, having met through mutual friends at a concert where we discovered our shared love of indie music and our similar approaches to life. He was a high school chemistry teacher with the kind of patience and genuine warmth that made him beloved by students and colleagues alike. Our relationship had always been characterized by steady, reliable partnership rather than dramatic passion, which suited both of us perfectly. We communicated well, we shared values about family and future, and we had built a life together that felt solid and real. Planning our wedding had been an extension of that partnership, with both of us contributing ideas and making decisions together with minimal conflict. The wedding was scheduled for late September, giving us 6 months to finalize all the arrangements. We had chosen a beautiful vineyard venue about an hour outside Seattle, a place that offered both indoor and outdoor spaces to accommodate the unpredictable Pacific Northwest weather. The guest list had grown to 175 people, a number that felt large to me but that both families insisted was necessary to include everyone who mattered to us. Marcus and I had spent countless evenings over the past few months carefully considering each name, discussing whether certain acquaintances were close enough to warrant an invitation, and navigating the complex politics of family expectations about +1s and children. My sister Claire was 2 years younger than me, currently 29, and worked as a social media manager for a boutique marketing agency in Portland, Oregon. She had moved there 3 years ago after a painful breakup, claiming she needed a fresh start away from Seattle and the memories associated with her failed relationship. Claire had always been the more outgoing and socially ambitious of the two of us, someone who collected friends easily and seemed to thrive in large social gatherings in ways that exhausted me. Growing up, she had been popular and confident while I had been more introverted and focused on academics, creating a dynamic where we occupied different social spheres despite being close in age. Our relationship as adults had been cordial, but not particularly intimate. We saw each other during holidays and family gatherings, exchanged text messages on birthdays and during major life events, and maintained the kind of surface-level sisterly connection that looked warm from the outside but lacked real depth. I had always attributed this distance to our different personalities and busy lives rather than to any fundamental problem between us. When she had enthusiastically offered to help with wedding planning during our family Christmas gathering, I had been touched and had interpreted it as an opportunity to strengthen our bond. Over the following months, Claire had indeed been involved in various aspects of the wedding preparation. She had accompanied me to dress fittings, offered opinions on flower arrangements, and helped me research photographers and caterers. She seemed genuinely excited about the wedding and frequently posted about it on her social media accounts, sharing behind-the-scenes glimpses of our planning sessions with captions about sisterly love and family celebration. Her followers, numbering in the tens of thousands due to her work in social media and her carefully curated personal brand, responded enthusiastically to these posts, and Claire basked in the attention and the narrative of being the devoted sister helping to create a perfect wedding. What I did not realize during those months of planning was that beneath Claire's helpful exterior, something darker was developing. I missed the signs that should have alerted me to trouble. The way she sometimes made comments about how lucky I was to have found someone like Marcus, delivered with a smile but containing an edge that suggested something other than pure happiness for me. The frequency with which she steered conversations back to her own dating struggles and her frustration with being single while her older sister was getting married. The occasions when she offered to handle certain tasks and then either forgot to complete them or made mistakes that created additional work for me to fix. I interpreted these incidents as the normal chaos of wedding planning rather than as evidence of deliberate sabotage. My parents, David and Susan Morrison, lived in Bellevue, a suburb of Seattle where Claire and I had grown up in comfortable upper-middle-class surroundings. Dad had worked as an architect before retiring 2 years ago, and Mom had been a librarian at our local public library for 30 years before her own retirement. They were good people who had provided stable, loving childhoods for both their daughters, though I had always sensed that they worried more about Claire than about me. I was the responsible one who made safe choices and followed predictable paths, while Claire was the one who took risks, experienced dramatic ups and downs, and required more emotional support and occasionally financial assistance when her impulsive decisions led to difficult consequences. When I had announced my engagement to Marcus, my parents had been genuinely delighted. They loved Marcus and had made it clear they considered him an ideal partner for me. The wedding planning had been something that brought our family together in positive ways, with Mom enthusiastically helping with various tasks and Dad generously offering to cover expenses that exceeded our budget. They had included Claire in many of these planning sessions, and I had appreciated watching my parents interact warmly with both their daughters during what felt like a significant family milestone. The image of family unity and shared joy seemed complete and genuine, at least from my perspective. Marcus's family had been equally supportive and enthusiastic about the wedding. His parents, Thomas and Lin Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan before Marcus was born and had built successful careers in engineering and medicine respectively. They were warm, generous people who had welcomed me into their family from the beginning of my relationship with Marcus. His younger brother Kevin was serving as best man, and his sister Michelle was one of my bridesmaids. The blending of our two families had proceeded smoothly, with both sets of parents getting along well and everyone seeming genuinely happy about the upcoming marriage. The digital invitation management system I was using had been recommended by a colleague who had recently gotten married. It was a comprehensive platform that allowed me to track addresses, meal preferences, RSVP status, and various other details for each guest. I had spent hours entering information, categorizing guests by relationship to bride or groom, organizing seating arrangements, and creating detailed notes about dietary restrictions, mobility concerns, and other considerations that would help us ensure every guest felt welcomed and comfortable. The system automatically backed up data to the cloud, which had given me peace of mind about not losing months of careful work to a computer malfunction. I had given Claire access to the system several weeks earlier when she had offered to help me verify addresses and contact information for some of the guests. She had a knack for tracking people down through social media and had successfully located current information for several old friends and distant relatives whose addresses I had been uncertain about. Granting her access had seemed like a practical way to leverage her skills and to give her a meaningful role in the wedding preparation beyond just attending dress fittings and offering opinions on decorations. That Saturday morning, I logged into the invitation system planning to do a final review before sending everything to the printer on Monday. Marcus and I had decided on elegant letterpress invitations with custom calligraphy, a splurge that represented a significant portion of our stationery budget but that we both felt was worth the investment for something our guests would keep as a memento. The printer had warned us that they needed the final guest list by Monday afternoon to ensure the invitations would be ready with enough time for addressing and mailing to meet our timeline. I clicked on the guest list tab and watched as the page loaded. The loading icon spun for longer than usual, which struck me as odd given that I had a fast internet connection and the system typically responded quickly. When the page finally populated, I stared at the screen in confusion, unable to process what I was seeing. The guest list, which should have contained 175 carefully curated names with complete information for each person, was almost entirely empty. Only 12 names remained, and they were all members of Marcus's immediate family. My first assumption was that I had somehow navigated to a filtered view or that the system was experiencing a technical glitch. I refreshed the page multiple times, logged out and logged back in, and even restarted my computer, but the result was the same each time. 163 names had simply vanished from the system, along with all their associated information, meal preferences, and notes. My entire family, except for my parents, was gone. All my friends were gone. Marcus's extended family and friends were gone. Years of relationships and connections had been erased from what was supposed to be a celebration of our life together. I felt a wave of panic as I began to understand the implications. Without that guest list, we had no way to send invitations to most of our guests. While I had physical address books and could theoretically reconstruct some of the information, many of the addresses had been researched specifically for the wedding and existed nowhere else. Distant relatives, old friends who had moved multiple times, and Marcus's family members overseas had all required detective work to locate, and that work had not been documented anywhere except in the now empty system. My hands shook as I navigated to the system's activity log, which tracked all changes made to the account. What I discovered there transformed my panic into something colder and more focused. The log showed that at 11:47 the previous night, someone had accessed the account and had performed a mass deletion of guest entries. The action had been deliberate and systematic, working through the list alphabetically and removing every entry except for those 12 names that had been left behind. The user who had performed this deletion was identified by the email address I had used to grant access weeks earlier. It was Claire's account. I sat frozen in my chair, staring at the screen and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There had to be an explanation. Perhaps Claire's account had been hacked. Perhaps she had accidentally triggered some function she did not understand. Perhaps there was some technical explanation that would make sense of this disaster. But even as I tried to construct innocent explanations, a part of my mind was already connecting this incident to other strange occurrences over the past few months. The photographer we had booked had called 2 weeks ago confused because they had received a cancellation request that Marcus and I had not authorized. When I had investigated, the cancellation had been submitted through an online form that required only basic information rather than a password-protected account. The florist had mentioned in passing that someone had called asking detailed questions about whether our deposit was refundable and what the cancellation policy was, though they had not actually canceled anything. The venue coordinator had forwarded me an email inquiry about whether our date might be available for someone else, sent from a generic email address that I had not recognized. At the time, I had dismissed these incidents as strange coincidences or administrative confusion. Now they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I grabbed my phone and called Claire. The call went directly to voicemail, which was unusual for a Saturday morning when she was typically active on social media and responsive to messages. I texted her asking her to call me immediately, marking the message as urgent. No response came. I called again an hour later with the same result. By early afternoon, when I had tried reaching her 6 times without success, I knew that her silence was not coincidental. She was avoiding me because she knew what I had discovered. Marcus came home from basketball to find me still sitting at the dining room table surrounded by printed spreadsheets and handwritten notes, trying desperately to reconstruct the guest list from memory and from whatever fragments of information I could locate in old emails and text messages. He immediately knew something was seriously wrong. I explained what had happened, watching his expression shift from confusion to disbelief to anger as he processed the information and examined the activity log himself. Marcus was not someone who angered easily. His temperament was generally calm and measured, shaped by years of managing classroom dynamics and dealing with difficult situations that required patience and diplomacy. But as he read through the evidence of deliberate sabotage, I saw a hardness in his expression that I had rarely witnessed. This was not just an attack on me, but an attack on our wedding, on the celebration we had planned together, and on the community of people we wanted to gather to witness our commitment. The violation was both personal and communal, and Marcus understood instinctively that this could not be dismissed or excused as a simple mistake. We spent the rest of that Saturday attempting damage control. We divided the task of reconstruction between us, with Marcus working on his side of the guest list and me working on mine. We called family members asking them to send us addresses for relatives. We searched through old Christmas card lists and birthday party invitations. We scoured social media profiles for location information. By the end of the day, we had recovered perhaps 60% of the information we needed, but significant gaps remained, particularly among Marcus's extended family overseas and among friends who had moved in recent years. The emotional toll of that day was profound. What should have been a joyful final step before sending invitations had become an exhausting crisis that left both of us frustrated and hurt. The violation of trust cut deeper than the practical inconvenience. Claire was my sister, someone who was supposed to be happy for me, someone who should have been helping to make this day special rather than actively working to destroy it. I kept returning to the question of why she would do something so deliberately cruel, but no explanation made sense to me. That night, lying in bed unable to sleep, I made a decision. I would not let this sabotage succeed. Claire had tried to destroy my wedding, but I would rebuild what she had torn down, and in the process, I would make sure there were consequences for her actions. I did not yet know what form those consequences would take, but I knew that allowing her to escape accountability would only enable future destruction. Sometimes protecting yourself and your future requires standing up to family members who are supposed to love you but who instead treat you as an enemy. That realization was painful but also clarifying, cutting through years of obligation and guilt to reveal a simple truth that I could no longer ignore. My sister had declared war on my happiness, and I would not surrender without fighting back. The Sunday morning after discovering the deletion brought no relief from the tension that had settled into my chest like a physical weight. I woke early after a fitful night of fragmented sleep, my mind cycling through the same questions and emotions that had consumed me since finding the empty guest list. Marcus was already awake beside me, scrolling through his phone with the focused intensity that indicated he was working on something important rather than casually browsing social media. When he noticed I was awake, he turned the screen toward me without saying anything, allowing me to read what he had discovered. Claire had posted on Instagram late the previous night, well after my repeated attempts to reach her had gone unanswered. The post featured a carefully composed photograph of her at a trendy Portland restaurant, wine glass raised toward the camera with the city lights glowing behind her through floor-to-ceiling windows. She looked radiant and carefree, her smile brilliant and her styling impeccable in the way that came naturally to someone who understood how to construct an image for maximum impact. The caption read simply, "Sometimes you have to clear away the clutter to make room for what really matters. New beginnings and fresh starts. Living my best life and not apologizing for it." The post had accumulated hundreds of likes and dozens of comments from her followers praising her confidence and asking what had inspired this particular moment of celebration. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold fury settle over me that was entirely different from the confused hurt of the previous day. This was not the post of someone who had accidentally deleted important data and was mortified by their mistake. This was not the response of someone who felt guilty about causing harm to their sister. This was a victory lap, a public celebration of sabotage that she thought she had executed without consequences. The phrase about clearing away clutter was particularly galling because it suggested that the people whose names she had deleted, the friends and family members who mattered to Marcus and me, were nothing more than obstacles to be removed. She had reduced our community to debris that needed to be swept aside. Marcus watched my face as I processed what I was seeing, and when I looked up at him, I saw that his expression mirrored my own feelings. The anger we both felt was not hot and impulsive but cold and determined. This was not something we could overlook or forgive without accountability. This was not a situation that could be resolved with a difficult conversation and an apology. Claire had committed an act of deliberate sabotage and was now publicly celebrating it in a way that demonstrated she felt no remorse whatsoever. The question was no longer whether we would confront her, but rather how we would ensure that confrontation led to real consequences rather than empty apologies followed by continued bad behavior. I took screenshots of Claire's post and of the activity log from the invitation system, documenting the timeline that showed her deletion of the guest list occurring just hours before her celebratory restaurant outing. The evidence formed a clear narrative that would be difficult for her to explain away with claims of accidental deletion or technical misunderstanding. Marcus suggested we also document all the other suspicious incidents from the past months, creating a comprehensive record of what now appeared to be a sustained campaign of interference with our wedding planning. We spent that Sunday morning compiling emails, text messages, and notes from conversations that together painted a picture of systematic sabotage. The photographer cancellation attempt had come from an email address that contained Claire's initials and a birth year that matched hers, though it was not the email address I had on file for her. The phone call to the florist asking about cancellation policies had come from a Portland area code during business hours when Claire would have been available to make such a call. The inquiry to the venue about date availability had been sent from a newly created email account with no history, but the writing style and specific details mentioned in the email suggested someone with insider knowledge of our wedding plans. Individually, each incident could be dismissed as coincidence or the actions of some unrelated troublemaker. Collectively, they formed an undeniable pattern. As we worked through this documentation process, I found myself revisiting memories from the past several months with new understanding. Claire's enthusiasm about helping with wedding planning now seemed less like sisterly devotion and more like strategic positioning to gain access to information and systems she could exploit. Her frequent social media posts about the wedding preparation now appeared to be about constructing a public image of herself as the supportive sister, creating plausible deniability for her actual intentions. Her comments about how lucky I was to have found Marcus, which I had interpreted as sincere happiness tinged with envy, now revealed themselves as containing genuine resentment that had been poorly disguised. I called my parents mid-morning on Sunday, needing to tell them what had happened before I confronted Claire directly. Dad answered the phone with his usual cheerful greeting, clearly expecting a routine check-in conversation about wedding details. His tone changed immediately when I told him I needed to discuss something serious about Claire. I heard him call to Mom to pick up the other extension, and within moments I had both parents on the line listening with growing concern as I explained the situation. I walked them through the evidence systematically, starting with the deleted guest list and the activity log that proved Claire had been the one to delete it. I showed them the timeline that connected the deletion to her celebratory social media post. I detailed the other suspicious incidents from recent months that now appeared to be part of a larger pattern. I kept my voice as calm and factual as possible, presenting information rather than launching accusations, though the effort to maintain that composure required significant self-control given how angry and hurt I felt. The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably as my parents processed what I had told them. Mom was the first to speak, her voice hesitant and confused, asking if there might be some explanation I had not considered. Perhaps Claire's account had been hacked by someone who wanted to cause trouble. Perhaps the activity log was somehow incorrect or had misidentified the user. Perhaps there was technical confusion that made innocent actions appear suspicious. I recognized these suggestions as the natural response of a mother who did not want to believe her daughter capable of such deliberate cruelty, but I also felt frustrated by the immediate impulse to find excuses rather than to accept uncomfortable evidence. Dad was more direct in his response, his principal instincts engaged by the systematic presentation of facts. He asked specific questions about the security of the invitation system, about whether anyone else had access to Claire's account, about whether I had confirmed that the social media post was actually from Claire rather than from someone impersonating her. I answered each question thoroughly, demonstrating that I had considered alternative explanations and had eliminated them through careful investigation. When I finished responding to his questions, Dad was quiet for a long moment before saying that the evidence was compelling and troubling, and that Claire needed to be confronted directly about her actions. Mom asked what I intended to do, her voice carrying worry not just about the situation itself but about the potential damage to family relationships if this escalated into serious conflict. I told her honestly that I did not yet know exactly what consequences would be appropriate, but that I was not willing to simply forgive and forget without real accountability. I explained that Marcus and I had spent the entire previous day trying to reconstruct the guest list that Claire had destroyed, that we might miss the printer deadline because of her sabotage, and that our wedding planning had been transformed from a joyful process into a stressful crisis management situation. I pointed out that this was not a momentary lapse in judgment but appeared to be a sustained campaign of interference, which suggested something seriously wrong with Claire's mental state or with her feelings toward me. Dad agreed that the situation required immediate family intervention and suggested we all meet together to confront Claire and demand an explanation. He proposed that he would contact Claire directly and insist she come to their house that afternoon for a family meeting, making it clear that her attendance was not optional. The firmness in his voice reminded me of conversations I had overheard throughout my childhood when he had dealt with students who had committed serious violations of school rules. He was shifting into the mode of an authority figure who needed to impose consequences and restore order, and while part of me appreciated his support, another part of me worried that a family meeting might allow Claire to manipulate the narrative or to minimize her actions through tears and apologies. Marcus and I discussed strategy after I ended the call with my parents. We agreed that the family meeting was necessary, but that we needed to be prepared for Claire to either deny responsibility entirely or to claim that her actions had been misunderstood or unintentional. We decided that I would lead the confrontation, presenting the evidence clearly and insisting on specific answers to direct questions rather than allowing vague deflections. Marcus would be there as support and as a witness, but also to represent his stake in the situation since the sabotage had targeted his family and friends as much as mine. We arrived at my parents' house in Bellevue at 3 o'clock that afternoon to find that Claire had not yet appeared despite Dad having told her to be there at 2:30. Mom looked anxious and kept checking her phone for messages while Dad paced near the front windows watching for Claire's car. The delay felt deliberate, a power play designed to keep everyone waiting and to create additional tension before the confrontation even began. I recognized this tactic from childhood dynamics when Claire had sometimes used strategic lateness to maintain control over situations where she felt defensive. Claire finally arrived at 3:45, nearly an hour and a half late, pulling into the driveway in her Audi sedan and taking her time gathering her things before walking toward the house. I watched her through the window and noted that her body language showed no signs of anxiety or guilt. She walked with confidence, her head high and her expression neutral, looking more like someone arriving for a casual family dinner than for a confrontation about serious misconduct. When she entered the house, she greeted everyone with casual hellos and moved to hug Mom before anyone could begin the difficult conversation. Dad stopped her before she could settle into her usual pattern of charming deflection, his voice carrying the stern authority that had commanded respect from thousands of students over his career. He directed her to sit down and informed her that we needed to discuss her actions regarding my wedding planning and specifically regarding the deletion of the guest list from the invitation management system. Claire's expression shifted subtly at these words, the casual confidence being replaced by something more guarded and calculating. She sat on the couch and arranged herself carefully, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap in a posture that projected composure even as her eyes darted between the four of us trying to assess the situation. I did not wait for further preamble but pulled out my laptop and opened it to show the activity log from the invitation system. I turned the screen toward Claire and asked her directly to explain why her account had been used to delete 163 names from my wedding guest list at 11:47 on Friday night. I kept my voice level and my question specific, not allowing room for her to redirect the conversation or to respond to some vaguer accusation that she could more easily dismiss. I wanted her to have to address the concrete evidence in front of all of us. Claire looked at the screen for several seconds before responding. Her first words were to claim that she had not deleted anything and that someone must have hacked her account. She suggested that perhaps I had given access to someone else who had used her credentials, or that the system itself had malfunctioned and had incorrectly logged the deletions under her account. Her tone was reasonable and slightly puzzled, as though she was simply trying to solve a technical mystery rather than deflecting from her own actions. It was a skilled performance that might have been convincing if I had not prepared for exactly this response. I showed her the next piece of evidence, which was her Instagram post from Friday night celebrating clearing away clutter and making room for what really matters, posted less than 2 hours after the deletion had occurred. I asked her to explain what she had been celebrating if not the successful sabotage of my wedding. I pointed out that the timing was too coincidental to dismiss and that the language she had used clearly referenced what she had just done. Claire's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise or annoyance that I had made this connection, but she recovered quickly and claimed that the post had been about something entirely unrelated to my wedding, about decisions she was making in her own life about which relationships and commitments deserved her energy. Marcus spoke up at this point, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel that indicated he was not willing to tolerate obvious lies. He pointed out that Claire had not responded to any of my calls or messages all day Saturday despite my marking them as urgent, which suggested she had been avoiding contact because she knew what I had discovered. He noted that someone who genuinely had not done anything wrong would have responded immediately to urgent messages from their sister, rather than going silent for more than 24 hours. Claire turned her attention to Marcus with an expression that contained barely concealed hostility, telling him that this was a family matter and that her communication patterns with her sister were not his concern. Dad intervened at that point, his voice sharp with disapproval at Claire's disrespectful tone toward Marcus. He reminded her that Marcus was about to become part of our family and that the wedding being sabotaged was as much his as mine. He told Claire that she needed to stop deflecting and needed to provide honest answers about what had happened and why. Mom sat silently watching this exchange with visible distress, clearly torn between her instinct to protect her younger daughter and her recognition that the evidence against Claire was damning. The confrontation continued for more than an hour, with Claire maintaining her denials despite the mounting evidence presented against her. She offered multiple contradictory explanations for various pieces of evidence, each one falling apart under scrutiny only to be replaced by a new story. She claimed she could not remember what she had been doing on Friday night. She suggested that perhaps she had accessed the system accidentally while helping with something else. She implied that I might have deleted the names myself and was trying to blame her. Each deflection became more desperate and less coherent as she realized that the evidence was too substantial to explain away. Finally, Mom asked the question that cut through all the tactical maneuvering and demanded truth. She looked directly at Claire and asked simply whether she had deleted the names from the guest list deliberately and whether she had done other things to interfere with wedding planning over the past months. The question was asked with a mother's authority that demanded honesty, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Claire's composure cracked completely. Her face contorted with emotion, and tears began to stream down her cheeks as years of resentment suddenly poured out in words that had apparently been building for much longer than just the period of wedding planning. Claire said that she was tired of watching me get everything I wanted while she struggled. She said that it was not fair that I had found someone like Marcus who was stable and kind and committed when her own relationships always ended in pain and disappointment. She said that our parents had always favored me, had always praised my accomplishments while dismissing hers, had always held her to impossible standards while allowing me to coast on being the responsible older daughter. She said that my wedding represented everything she did not have and everything she might never have, and that she could not stand to watch me celebrate a happiness that felt like a personal rejection of her own worth. The words came out in a torrent of pain and anger that was clearly genuine, even as it was completely misdirected. Claire was not actually angry at me, but at her own life circumstances and at choices she had made that had led to outcomes she regretted. She had transformed me into a symbol of everything she felt she lacked, rather than seeing me as a separate person with my own struggles and my own journey. Her sabotage of my wedding had been an attempt to tear down what she perceived as my perfect life, as though destroying my happiness could somehow ease her own suffering or restore some imaginary fairness to the universe. I listened to this confession, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Part of me felt genuine sympathy for the pain Claire was clearly experiencing. Sibling rivalry and comparative thinking can create real anguish, and I understood that watching your younger sibling get married while you are struggling with loneliness and failed relationships must be genuinely difficult. But sympathy did not erase the fact that Claire had acted on these feelings in ways that were deliberately harmful and that had caused real damage to people who had done nothing to hurt her. Understanding someone's pain does not require accepting their destructive behavior as justified or excusable. When Claire finished her emotional outpouring, the room fell silent for several moments. Dad was the one who finally spoke, his voice heavy with disappointment. He told Claire that while he understood she was struggling with difficult emotions, her actions were unacceptable and inexcusable. He pointed out that jealousy and resentment are normal human feelings, but that acting on those feelings by sabotaging someone else's happiness was a choice that revealed serious character problems. He said that Claire needed professional help to address whatever was causing her to lash out at family members who loved her, and that until she got that help and made genuine amends for the harm she had caused, she would not be welcome at family gatherings, including the wedding. Claire's tears immediately transformed into anger at Dad's words. She stood abruptly and accused him of taking my side as he always did, of never understanding her or supporting her when she needed him. She told Mom that she should have known better than to expect any compassion or understanding from this family. She grabbed her purse and announced that she was leaving and that they should not expect to hear from her again since it was clear she was not wanted. The dramatic exit was undermined somewhat by her needing to search for her car keys, but within minutes she had stormed out of the house and driven away, leaving the rest of us sitting in uncomfortable silence processing what had just occurred. Mom was crying quietly, clearly devastated by the family rupture that had just occurred. Dad looked grim but resolute, his decision made despite the emotional cost. Marcus reached over and took my hand, providing silent support as I tried to process the chaotic mix of vindication, sadness, and ongoing anger that Claire's confession had created. I had the truth I had sought, the confirmation that my suspicions were correct and that the sabotage had been deliberate. But having that truth did not feel like the victory I had imagined it would be. Instead, it felt like the painful exposure of damage that had been festering beneath the surface of our family relationships for years, damage that would not be easily repaired regardless of what consequences Claire faced for her actions. The days following the confrontation at my parents' house unfolded with a strange mixture of relief and escalating anxiety that made it difficult to focus on the practical work of wedding planning that still demanded my attention. Marcus and I had successfully reconstructed approximately 75% of the guest list through our combined efforts over the weekend, but significant gaps remained that required additional detective work and outreach to family members who might have contact information we lacked. The printer deadline had passed, forcing us to push back our invitation mailing date by 2 weeks and compressing our timeline in ways that created cascading pressure on other aspects of the planning process. Every hour spent recovering from Claire's sabotage was an hour not spent on the dozens of other decisions and tasks that still required attention before September. I found myself waking in the middle of the night with my mind racing through scenarios and questions that had no easy answers. Claire had confessed to the deletion and had made clear through her emotional outbursts that her actions had been motivated by jealousy and resentment rather than by any specific grievance I could address or resolve. The confession should have provided closure, a clear endpoint to the uncertainty and suspicion that had dominated my thoughts since discovering the empty guest list. Instead, the confrontation had opened new questions about what appropriate consequences should look like and about what responsibility I bore for ensuring those consequences were implemented rather than allowing the situation to fade into uncomfortable family history that everyone tacitly agreed not to discuss. Dad had banned Claire from family gatherings, including the wedding, a decision that carried real weight given his role as the authority figure in our family and given Mom's general deference to his judgment on matters of discipline and accountability. But I understood that family bans were difficult to enforce over time, particularly when holidays and major milestones created natural pressure to restore normal relationships and to forgive past transgressions in the name of family unity. I had witnessed this pattern throughout my life when various extended family members had feuded and had declared permanent ruptures that eventually softened into awkward reconciliations driven more by social pressure than by genuine resolution of underlying conflicts. The question that consumed much of my mental energy during those days was whether Dad's ban was sufficient consequence for what Claire had done or whether additional accountability was necessary. Part of me wanted to simply move forward with wedding planning and to treat Claire's exclusion from the celebration as adequate punishment for her sabotage. This path offered the least disruption to family dynamics and allowed everyone except Claire to proceed with enjoying the wedding without the shadow of ongoing conflict. It was the path of least resistance, the choice that would make me appear reasonable and forgiving in the eyes of extended family members who would inevitably learn about the situation and would form opinions about how I had handled it. But another part of me recognized that allowing Claire to face only social consequences within our immediate family did nothing to address the broader pattern of destructive behavior she had exhibited or to prevent her from targeting future victims when her resentment and jealousy found new objects. The sabotage of my wedding had not been an isolated incident of poor judgment, but rather the culmination of months of smaller acts of interference that together revealed someone whose ability to distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable behavior had become seriously compromised. Claire needed intervention that went beyond family disappointment and temporary exclusion from gatherings. She needed consequences significant enough to force genuine self-reflection and behavior change, rather than simply making her more careful about getting caught in the future. Marcus and I had long conversations about these questions during the evenings after work, sitting together on our apartment balcony watching the sun set over Elliott Bay while we tried to think through the implications of different choices. Marcus approached the situation with his characteristic thoughtfulness, asking questions designed to help me clarify my own values and priorities rather than simply telling me what he thought I should do. He pointed out that my instinct toward minimizing conflict and preserving family harmony was admirable in many contexts, but that it could also enable people like Claire to avoid facing the full weight of their choices. He reminded me that teachers and parents who truly cared about students and children sometimes had to implement consequences that felt harsh in the moment but that served important developmental purposes over time. I appreciated Marcus's perspective while also wrestling with the reality that he came from a family culture that was more direct about addressing conflicts and implementing accountability than my own family had ever been. The Chen family operated with clear expectations and explicit consequences for behavior that violated those expectations, a directness that sometimes felt uncomfortable to me given my upbringing in a household where uncomfortable truths were often softened or avoided in the name of keeping peace. I worried that my impulse to pursue serious consequences for Claire might be influenced by Marcus's family culture rather than emerging from my own authentic values, and I did not want to take actions I would later regret simply because I was trying to live up to standards that were not actually my own. My friend Jennifer, who had been my college roommate and who remained one of my closest confidants despite living across the country in Boston, offered a different perspective when I called her to talk through the situation. Jennifer worked as a prosecutor specializing in white-collar crime, and her professional experience had given her a particular framework for thinking about accountability and consequences. She listened to my explanation of what had happened and then asked a series of questions that forced me to think about the situation in new ways. What harm had actually been caused by Claire's actions? Who were the victims beyond just Marcus and myself? What would justice look like in this situation if it were not complicated by family relationships? Jennifer's questions helped me recognize that I had been thinking about the situation too narrowly, focusing primarily on my own hurt feelings and on the inconvenience Claire had caused to my wedding planning. But the sabotage had affected many more people than just Marcus and me. The guests whose names Claire had deleted were people who cared about us and who deserved to receive invitations to celebrate with us. Some of them were elderly relatives for whom this might be one of their last opportunities to attend a family wedding. Some were friends who had supported us through difficult times and who had earned the right to share in our joy. By deleting their information, Claire had not just attacked Marcus and me, but had attempted to exclude an entire community from an event that was as much about them as it was about us. Beyond the immediate harm to our wedding plans, Jennifer pointed out that Claire's behavior suggested someone who felt entitled to manipulate systems and to harm others when she felt aggrieved, and that this pattern would likely continue in other contexts unless serious intervention occurred. She asked whether Claire had exhibited similar behavior in other relationships or professional contexts, and when I thought carefully about the question, I realized that Claire's romantic relationship failures and her pattern of job changes might reflect ongoing interpersonal problems rather than simply bad luck as I had always assumed. Jennifer suggested that allowing Claire to face consequences only within our private family sphere might be doing her a disservice by shielding her from the kind of wake-up call she needed to recognize that her behavior was genuinely problematic. The conversation with Jennifer shifted something in my thinking. I had been approaching the situation as though my primary obligation was to balance my own hurt against my desire to preserve family relationships and to avoid being seen as vindictive or unforgiving. But framing the situation that way made it entirely about my personal feelings rather than about broader principles of accountability and about protection of potential future victims of Claire's behavior. If I truly believed that what Claire had done was seriously wrong rather than just personally hurtful to me, then I had an obligation to pursue consequences that reflected the seriousness of her actions regardless of how those consequences might affect family dynamics or how they might cause people to perceive me. I began researching what legal options might exist for addressing deliberate digital sabotage of the type Claire had committed. The invitation management system was a paid service that I had purchased, and the data contained within it represented significant time and effort to compile. Claire's deletion of that data constituted destruction of property in some sense, though I was uncertain whether digital information received the same legal protections as physical property. I discovered through online research that many jurisdictions had laws addressing unauthorized access to computer systems and data destruction, though the specific applicability of those laws depended on technical details about how the system access had been granted and what actions Claire had taken. The deeper I went into this research, the more I recognized that pursuing legal consequences for Claire's actions would represent a fundamental escalation that would likely create permanent ruptures within my family. Filing a police report or pursuing civil action against my own sister would be seen by many people, including potentially my own mother, as an extreme overreaction that prioritized punishment over family bonds. I could envision the conversations that would occur among extended family members, the criticism I would face for being unforgiving and legalistic about what some would characterize as a family squabble that should have been handled privately. The social costs of pursuing formal accountability would be substantial and would affect not just my relationship with Claire, but my relationships with numerous other family members who would feel compelled to take sides. Yet the alternative was to allow Claire's behavior to be treated as a private matter that had been adequately addressed through Dad's temporary ban from family events, a consequence that carried no lasting impact and that would likely be forgotten or forgiven within a year or two when the immediate emotions faded. That path preserved family harmony in the short term but communicated that deliberate sabotage and destruction of property would be tolerated within our family as long as the perpetrator was a blood relative and as long as they expressed sufficient remorse after being caught. I thought about what lessons my future children might learn from watching how I handled the situation, about what I would want to model for them regarding standing up for themselves and refusing to accept mistreatment even from people they loved. Marcus found me late one evening sitting at my laptop surrounded by printouts of statutes and legal articles about computer crimes and digital property rights. He sat down beside me and asked gently whether I had made any decisions about how to proceed. I told him honestly that I was torn between competing values and competing visions of who I wanted to be. Part of me wanted to be the person who prioritized family relationships above all else, who found ways to forgive and move forward even when forgiveness was difficult. But another part of me wanted to be the person who stood up against wrongdoing regardless of who committed it, who refused to enable destructive behavior simply because calling it out would be uncomfortable or socially costly. Marcus reminded me that these two versions of myself did not have to be mutually exclusive, that it was possible to hold people accountable while also leaving room for eventual forgiveness and reconciliation. He pointed out that serious consequences implemented now might actually serve the long-term health of my relationship with Claire better than superficial forgiveness that left underlying resentments unaddressed. He shared a story from his first year of teaching when he had needed to report a student for academic dishonesty despite liking the student personally and despite knowing the report would have serious consequences for the student's college applications. The decision had been painful, but years later the student had reached out to thank him, explaining that facing real consequences had been a turning point that forced important growth and self-examination. I spent the weekend creating a detailed timeline of all the suspicious incidents that had occurred during the wedding planning process, compiling evidence that demonstrated a pattern of interference rather than just the single incident of the deleted guest list. I gathered the emails about the photographer cancellation attempt, the notes from my conversation with the florist about the inquiry regarding our cancellation policy, and the forwarded email from the venue coordinator about date availability. I assembled Claire's social media posts that seemed to celebrate the sabotage or that demonstrated her access to detailed information about our wedding plans. I documented the hours Marcus and I had spent reconstructing the guest list and the costs we had incurred from missing the printer deadline and needing to rush alternative arrangements. When I finished this documentation process, I had a comprehensive record that told a clear story of sustained sabotage over multiple months, culminating in the deletion of the guest list and Claire's subsequent confession during the family confrontation. The evidence was substantial enough that I felt confident it could support either legal action or at minimum a credible threat of legal action that might force Claire to take the situation more seriously than she apparently had based on her lack of any attempt to apologize or make amends since the confrontation. The question remained whether I had the courage to actually use this evidence in ways that would create permanent consequences rather than just compiling it as an intellectual exercise. On Monday morning, I called my parents and asked to speak with both of them together. I explained that I had been thinking carefully about appropriate consequences for Claire's actions and that I had decided I needed to pursue options beyond just excluding her from family events. I told them I was considering filing a police report about the unauthorized access to the invitation system and the destruction of data, and that I wanted them to hear about this decision from me before I took action. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched uncomfortably before Mom finally spoke, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Mom begged me to reconsider, arguing that involving law enforcement would destroy any possibility of future reconciliation with Claire and would create family trauma that could never be fully healed. She pointed out that Claire was struggling with mental health issues and that criminal charges would make her situation worse rather than helping her get the support she needed. She reminded me that Claire was still my sister regardless of what she had done, and that family loyalty should mean something even when family members made terrible mistakes. The pain in Mom's voice was genuine and affected me deeply, forcing me to confront the reality that pursuing accountability for Claire meant inflicting pain on my mother, who had done nothing wrong and who loved both her daughters despite our very different choices and behaviors. Dad's response was more measured but ultimately aligned with Mom's position. He acknowledged that what Claire had done was serious and deserved consequences, but he questioned whether criminal charges were proportionate to the actual harm caused. He pointed out that Marcus and I had successfully reconstructed most of the guest list and that the wedding would proceed as planned even if on a slightly delayed timeline. He suggested that the family rupture and social consequences Claire was already facing might be sufficient to prompt the behavior change and self-reflection that I hoped legal action would achieve. He asked me to consider whether my desire to pursue charges was really about justice and accountability, or whether it was about anger and a wish to punish Claire for hurting me. Dad's question hit hard because it forced me to examine my own motivations with uncomfortable honesty. Was I pursuing legal action because I genuinely believed it was the right thing to do, or was I pursuing it because I was angry and wanted Claire to suffer consequences that felt proportionate to the suffering she had caused me? The distinction mattered because actions taken from a place of vindictiveness rarely led to outcomes I would be proud of later, while actions taken from principled commitment to accountability could be maintained with integrity even when they were difficult or costly. I told my parents I would think more about their concerns before making a final decision, but I also made clear that I was not willing to simply let the situation fade away without Claire facing consequences beyond temporary social exclusion. That evening, I sat down with Marcus and told him about the conversation with my parents and about Dad's challenging question regarding my motivations. Marcus listened carefully and then asked me to consider a slightly different question. Regardless of what I decided to do about legal action, what did I need from Claire in order to feel that justice had been served and that I could move forward without ongoing resentment poisoning my wedding celebration and my future family relationships? His reframing helped me recognize that I had been so focused on what consequences Claire should face that I had not clearly articulated what outcome would actually feel like resolution rather than just punishment. I realized that what I needed was not primarily to see Claire suffer, but rather to receive genuine acknowledgement of the harm she had caused, authentic apology that demonstrated understanding of how her actions had affected multiple people beyond just me, and concrete evidence of commitment to changing the patterns of behavior that had led to the sabotage. I needed to know that she understood the seriousness of what she had done, and that she was taking active steps to address whatever internal issues had driven her to such destructive choices. Without those elements, any consequence I imposed would feel hollow because it would not address the underlying relationship damage or provide any foundation for eventual healing. The question then became whether there was any way to communicate these needs to Claire in a manner that might actually prompt the response I hoped for, or whether the family confrontation and subsequent silence had already foreclosed the possibility of productive dialogue. Claire had not reached out to me at all since storming out of my parents' house, suggesting either that she remained too angry and defensive to engage, or that she simply did not care enough about repairing the relationship to make the effort. I debated whether I should initiate contact myself despite being the wrong party, or whether reaching out would be interpreted as weakness and would undermine any possibility of Claire taking the situation seriously. Marcus suggested that before making decisions about legal action, I should give Claire one clear opportunity to make things right through direct communication of what I needed from her and explicit consequences if those needs were not met. He pointed out that while I had no obligation to offer this opportunity given that Claire was the one who had caused harm, doing so would allow me to move forward confident that I had done everything possible to resolve the situation without escalating to formal legal processes. If Claire responded with genuine accountability and commitment to change, the legal option could remain available as enforcement if she failed to follow through on her commitments. If she responded with continued defensiveness or with refusal to engage, then I would know that legal action was necessary because informal accountability had been explicitly rejected. This approach felt right to me because it balanced my competing values of preserving family relationships when possible while also refusing to enable destructive behavior through excessive forgiveness. It gave Claire agency to determine through her own choices what consequences she would face, rather than having those consequences imposed entirely from outside. It created a clear framework where I could maintain my integrity and commitment to accountability, while also leaving space for the possibility of redemption and repair if Claire was willing to do the hard work those outcomes required. The path forward was not easy and offered no guarantees of success, but it felt more aligned with who I wanted to be than either immediate legal action or passive acceptance of inadequate consequences. The decision to offer Claire one final opportunity for accountability before pursuing legal action required careful preparation and strategic thinking that extended beyond simply drafting a message stating my expectations. I needed to create conditions where Claire would take my communications seriously rather than dismissing it as empty threats or as emotional overreaction that would fade with time. This meant building a support structure that would reinforce the legitimacy of my demands and that would provide both practical assistance and emotional backing as I navigated what promised to be a difficult and potentially contentious process. My first step was to consult with an attorney who specialized in technology law and digital property rights to understand exactly what legal options were available and what evidence would be required to pursue those options effectively. Marcus had a colleague whose sister practiced law in Seattle, and through that connection I was able to schedule a consultation for later in the week. Having concrete legal information would strengthen my position significantly because it would transform my threat of legal action from vague possibility into specific consequence with clear procedures and likely outcomes. Claire needed to understand that I was not simply making emotional statements about involving authorities, but rather had done the research and preparation necessary to follow through if she refused to engage in meaningful accountability. I also needed to address the practical reality that pursuing any kind of formal consequence for Claire's actions would require significant time and emotional energy during a period when I was already stressed by compressed wedding planning timelines and the normal demands of my full-time job. Project management at a tech startup was demanding under ordinary circumstances, and the past week had already required me to take time off work to deal with the crisis Claire had created. I could not afford to let wedding preparation or professional responsibilities slide further, which meant I needed to delegate tasks and to accept help from people who had offered their support. Marcus had been my primary source of emotional and practical support throughout the crisis, but I recognized that relying entirely on him was neither fair nor sustainable. He had his own professional obligations as a teacher, with semester finals approaching and the associated workload of grading and student conferences that consumed most of his evenings. More importantly, this was fundamentally my family situation and my decision about how to proceed, and while Marcus's input was valuable, I needed to ensure I was not outsourcing the difficult emotional work of determining my own boundaries and values to someone else simply because making those determinations was uncomfortable. I reached out to my friend Jennifer again, this time not just for perspective, but to ask whether she would be willing to review the evidence I had compiled and to provide informal guidance about how to structure my communication to Claire in ways that would be most effective. Jennifer agreed immediately and suggested we schedule a video call for the weekend when she would have time to review materials thoroughly and to discuss strategy in detail. Having someone with prosecutorial experience examine my documentation would help me understand whether I was being realistic about the strength of my case or whether I was overestimating what the evidence actually demonstrated. My college friend Amanda, who lived in Seattle and who had been one of the first people I called after discovering the deleted guest list, offered to help with the ongoing work of reconstructing missing invitation information and coordinating with vendors about timeline adjustments. Amanda worked as an event planner and brought professional expertise to the logistical challenges we were facing. More importantly, she brought perspective from outside my immediate family that helped me separate normal wedding stress from the specific problems created by Claire's sabotage. Amanda had witnessed family dynamics at numerous weddings throughout her career and was able to contextualize my situation within broader patterns she had observed, which helped me feel less isolated and less like I was overreacting to something that might be more common than I realized. Through Amanda, I learned that family sabotage of weddings was actually more prevalent than I had imagined, though it typically took different forms than what Claire had done. Amanda shared stories of mothers who undermined their children's wedding plans because they disagreed with the match, of siblings who caused scenes at ceremonies because they felt neglected or jealous, of extended family members who spread rumors or created unnecessary drama because they thrived on attention and conflict. Hearing these stories did not make what Claire had done acceptable, but it did help me understand that my instinct to take the situation seriously and to implement consequences was aligned with how other people who dealt with family dysfunction professionally thought about these patterns. I also needed to strengthen my relationship with my parents and to ensure they understood that pursuing accountability for Claire was not an attack on them or a rejection of family values, but rather an expression of different values about what family loyalty actually required. The conversation after I told them I was considering legal action had left things tense between us, with Mom particularly seeming to view my position as choosing punishment over compassion. I called and asked whether I could come over to talk more about the situation when emotions were less heightened and when we could have a substantive conversation about values rather than just reacting to immediate decisions. Dad and Mom agreed to meet on Wednesday evening, and I prepared for that conversation by thinking carefully about how to frame my perspective in ways that might resonate with their own values rather than simply asserting my right to make my own decisions. I knew that my parents genuinely loved both Claire and me, and that they were caught in an impossible position where supporting one daughter seemed to require disappointing the other. I wanted to find language that acknowledged the difficulty of their position, while also making clear that enabling Claire's behavior by minimizing consequences was ultimately harmful to her as well as to me. When I arrived at my parents' house on Wednesday, Mom had prepared dinner in what I recognized as her way of creating normalcy and comfort during difficult conversations. We ate together with relatively little discussion of the situation, maintaining the family ritual of sharing a meal even as unresolved tension hung over the table. After dinner, we moved to the living room and I began the conversation by thanking them for being willing to talk further and by acknowledging that I understood how difficult this situation was for them as parents who loved both their daughters. I explained that I had spent considerable time since our last conversation examining my own motivations and trying to distinguish between a desire for punishment driven by anger and a commitment to accountability driven by principle. I told them about my conversations with Jennifer and with Marcus about what justice and resolution might actually look like in this situation. I shared my conclusion that what I needed was not primarily to see Claire suffer, but rather to receive genuine acknowledgement of harm, authentic apology, and concrete evidence of commitment to change. I explained that I was planning to communicate these needs directly to Claire and to give her a clear opportunity to respond before taking any legal action. Dad listened carefully and then asked a question that demonstrated he had been thinking deeply about the situation as well. He asked how I would know whether Claire's response was genuine or whether she was simply saying what I wanted to hear in order to avoid legal consequences. It was an astute question that went directly to the heart of the challenge I faced. Claire was skilled at emotional manipulation and at presenting herself in ways that generated sympathy and deflected accountability. Any apology she offered would need to be evaluated not just on the words she used, but on whether her subsequent actions demonstrated real change in understanding and behavior. I acknowledged that distinguishing genuine accountability from strategic performance was difficult, and that I would need to trust my instincts while also setting clear behavioral expectations that Claire would need to meet over time rather than just in an initial response. I explained that I was planning to require specific actions from Claire beyond just verbal apology, including participation in therapy to address the underlying issues that had driven her destructive behavior, public acknowledgement on social media that she had interfered with wedding planning and that her previous posts had misrepresented the situation, and tangible efforts to repair the practical damage she had caused by helping to complete the remaining work of finalizing the guest list and coordinating with vendors. Mom asked whether requiring public acknowledgement on social media was necessary or whether it was designed to humiliate Claire rather than to achieve accountability. I had anticipated this question and had thought carefully about my answer. I explained that Claire had used social media to celebrate her sabotage and to construct a public narrative where she was living her best life while implicitly diminishing the importance of my wedding and the people who were supposed to attend it. Allowing that narrative to stand uncorrected would mean that hundreds of people who followed Claire on social media would have a completely distorted understanding of what had actually occurred. Public acknowledgement was not about humiliation but about truth and about Claire taking responsibility for the image she had projected that was fundamentally dishonest. Dad nodded slowly at this explanation and said that he thought my requirements were reasonable and that they reflected genuine interest in accountability rather than vindictiveness. He said that he and Mom would support my decision to communicate these expectations to Claire and would not interfere with whatever consequences resulted from her response. Mom was less comfortable with this position but ultimately agreed that I had the right to determine what I needed in order to move forward and that they could not protect Claire from consequences she had brought upon herself through her own choices. The conversation with my parents helped clarify my thinking and strengthen my resolve to proceed with the communication to Claire. Having their support, even if it was somewhat reluctant on Mom's part, meant that I would not be completely isolated within my family when Claire inevitably portrayed herself as the victim of my unreasonable demands. It also meant that my parents would not undermine whatever consequences I implemented by offering Claire alternative support that allowed her to avoid facing the full weight of her actions. My consultation with the attorney took place on Thursday afternoon at a downtown Seattle office with views of the waterfront that would have been calming under different circumstances. The attorney, whose name was Catherine Reeves, was in her early 40s with the kind of direct, no-nonsense demeanor that inspired confidence. I had sent her the documentation I had compiled in advance of our meeting, and she had clearly reviewed it thoroughly because she began our conversation by stating that I had a stronger case than many clients brought to initial consultations. Catherine explained that Washington state law included provisions for unauthorized access to computer systems and for destruction of digital property that could potentially apply to Claire's actions. The key legal question was whether Claire's initial authorized access to the invitation management system, which I had granted willingly for legitimate purposes, meant that her subsequent use of that access to delete data could still be considered unauthorized. Catherine believed that a prosecutor could argue successfully that authorization for limited purposes did not extend to destructive actions that were clearly outside the scope of the originally granted access, particularly when those actions were motivated by personal animosity rather than by any legitimate wedding planning need. Catherine also explained that the practical challenges of pursuing criminal charges were significant. The police and prosecutors were overwhelmed with cases involving more serious harms and more vulnerable victims, and they might be reluctant to devote resources to what could be characterized as a family dispute over wedding planning. Even if charges were filed, the case might be dismissed or might result in minimal consequences given that this was a first offense with no physical harm or significant financial loss. The civil route, pursuing a lawsuit for damages and for the cost of reconstructing data and adjusting timelines, might be more feasible but would still require significant time and money with uncertain outcomes. What Catherine recommended instead was using the threat of legal action as leverage to force Claire to agree to a structured accountability arrangement that could be enforced through civil means if she failed to comply. She suggested drafting a formal demand letter that outlined the harm Claire had caused, specified what actions I required from her to resolve the situation without legal proceedings, and made clear what legal options I would pursue if those requirements were not met within a specified timeframe. The letter would demonstrate that I was serious and prepared to follow through while also giving Claire one clear opportunity to avoid formal legal consequences through voluntary accountability. Catherine offered to draft this demand letter for me, incorporating the specific requirements I had identified and framing them in legal language that would communicate the seriousness of the situation. She also suggested that we include a provision requiring Claire to enter into a formal written agreement acknowledging her actions and committing to specific behavioral changes, with financial penalties that would be automatically triggered if she violated the terms of the agreement. This approach would create a middle path between taking no action beyond family consequences and immediately pursuing criminal or civil litigation, giving Claire agency to determine her own fate while also protecting me from future sabotage or harassment. The consultation with Catherine was transformative because it gave me both practical tools and increased confidence that my instincts about the seriousness of the situation were correct. Having a legal professional validate that Claire's actions could potentially constitute crimes and certainly constituted civil wrongs helped me feel less like I was overreacting and more like I was appropriately defending my boundaries and my rights. The demand letter strategy felt particularly aligned with my values because it preserved the possibility of resolution without court involvement while making clear that I would not accept superficial accountability or empty apologies. I left Catherine's office with an agreement that she would draft the demand letter within a few days based on the outline we had discussed, and that I would review it before deciding whether to send it directly to Claire or to involve my parents in the delivery. Catherine had suggested that having my parents present when Claire received the letter might increase the likelihood that she would take it seriously, rather than dismissing it as just another expression of my anger that would fade with time. My video call with Jennifer took place on Saturday morning, with her reviewing the evidence I had compiled and asking detailed questions about timeline and about Claire's state of mind during various interactions. Jennifer's prosecutorial perspective brought a different lens than Catherine's civil attorney approach had, focusing more on whether Claire's actions demonstrated a pattern of behavior that suggested ongoing risk to others rather than just on the specific harm caused in this instance. Jennifer pointed out that people who engaged in deliberate sabotage of important life events for family members often exhibited similar patterns in other relationships and contexts, and that Claire's history of failed relationships and job changes might be worth examining more carefully to determine whether there were other instances of her retaliating against people she perceived as threats or competition. This line of inquiry made me uncomfortable because it felt like invading Claire's privacy and because it risked transforming my legitimate grievance about her sabotage of my wedding into a broader campaign to expose all her flaws and failures. Jennifer sensed my discomfort and clarified that she was not suggesting I needed to investigate Claire's entire life history, but rather that I should be aware that the wedding sabotage might be part of a larger pattern that would require more intensive intervention than just addressing this single incident. She suggested that any accountability arrangement I negotiated with Claire should include requirements for ongoing therapy and should have monitoring mechanisms to ensure compliance rather than just accepting her initial promises as sufficient. Jennifer also provided valuable perspective on the social media component of my requirements for Claire. She explained that in cases where defendants or wrongdoers had used social media to spread false narratives about their victims, requiring public correction as part of settlement agreements was increasingly common and was generally viewed as reasonable rather than as vindictive. She emphasized that I should be specific about what Claire needed to say in her public acknowledgement, providing her with exact language rather than allowing her to craft something that might appear to take responsibility while actually continuing to minimize or deflect. The acknowledgement needed to clearly state what she had done, acknowledge the harm it caused, and take full responsibility without qualifications or excuses. By the end of the weekend, I had assembled a comprehensive support network that included legal expertise, prosecutorial perspective, event planning assistance, and emotional backing from friends who understood both the personal and practical dimensions of what I was dealing with. I had clarified my own values and motivations through difficult conversations with my parents and with Marcus. I had specific requirements ready to communicate to Claire and a legal strategy for enforcing those requirements if she refused to meet them voluntarily. The preparation felt empowering because it transformed my initial reaction of hurt and anger into a structured approach that balanced accountability with the possibility of redemption. Marcus and I spent Sunday evening drafting the message I would send to Claire before the formal demand letter arrived. This initial message would be less legalistic and would come from me personally rather than from an attorney, giving Claire advance warning that serious consequences were coming and giving her the opportunity to respond before the situation escalated further. We debated about tone and about how much detail to include, ultimately deciding to keep the message relatively brief and focused on the key point that she needed to take immediate action to address the harm she had caused, or she would face legal consequences she would not be able to dismiss or avoid. The message explained that I had consulted with legal counsel and had learned that her actions potentially constituted both criminal and civil violations. It stated clearly that I was prepared to pursue formal legal action, but that I preferred to resolve the situation through direct accountability if she was willing to engage seriously. It specified that she had 48 hours to contact me to discuss terms for voluntary resolution before I would proceed with filing a police report and sending a formal demand letter. It ended by stating that I hoped she would choose accountability and repair over continued defensiveness and denial, but that the choice was entirely hers and that I would accept whatever consequences resulted from her decision. I sent the message on Sunday night at 8 o'clock, timing it so that Claire would likely see it that evening when she was typically active on her phone but would have the night to process her initial reaction before needing to respond. Marcus sat beside me as I pressed send, and we both stared at the phone screen showing the message as delivered. There was no way to know how Claire would respond or whether she would respond at all within the 48-hour window I had specified. All I could do was wait and continue with the wedding planning tasks that still required attention regardless of how the situation with Claire resolved. The waiting was more difficult than I had anticipated. Every notification on my phone made my heart race with the possibility that it might be Claire's response, and the hours passing without any communication created mounting anxiety about what her silence might mean. Was she consulting with her own attorney about how to respond? Was she planning to ignore the message entirely and dare me to follow through on my threats? Was she genuinely considering what accountability might look like and trying to formulate a response that would meet my requirements? The uncertainty was exhausting and made it nearly impossible to focus on anything else. By Monday evening, 24 hours had passed without any response from Claire. I had maintained my normal work schedule and had even managed to finalize some remaining wedding details with Amanda's help, but the situation with Claire occupied constant background space in my thoughts regardless of what else I was doing. Marcus encouraged me to have faith that Claire would respond within the deadline and that the strength of my message would have impact even if her initial reaction was defensive or angry. I wanted to believe him but found myself preparing emotionally for the possibility that she would refuse to engage and that I would need to follow through on the legal consequences I had outlined. The 48-hour deadline I had given Claire approached with agonizing slowness, each passing hour increasing my certainty that she had chosen to ignore my message and force me to follow through on the legal consequences I had outlined. Tuesday morning arrived with still no response, and I found myself checking my phone compulsively between meetings at work, unable to fully concentrate on the project deliverables that required my attention. My team had noticed my distraction over the past week, and while I had shared only minimal details about personal challenges affecting my focus, I knew that my performance was suffering in ways that could not continue much longer without jeopardizing relationships with colleagues and clients who depended on my leadership. Marcus texted me during his lunch period to ask whether I had heard anything from Claire and to remind me that silence was itself a form of response that provided important information about her priorities and her willingness to take accountability seriously. He was right that Claire's failure to engage within the time frame I had specified communicated something significant about how she viewed both the situation and her relationship with me. Someone who genuinely understood the gravity of what she had done and who wanted to repair the damage would have responded quickly, even if that response was to ask for more time to formulate a thoughtful reply. The extended silence suggested either that Claire did not believe I would actually follow through on my stated consequences, or that she had decided she did not care about preserving any relationship with me going forward. At 3:47 on Tuesday afternoon, with less than 5 hours remaining before my deadline expired, my phone finally displayed a notification showing an incoming call from Claire's number. I was in the middle of a status meeting with my development team, and I had to excuse myself abruptly to take the call in a conference room where I could speak privately. My hands trembled slightly as I answered, uncertain whether I was about to hear genuine accountability or another round of defensiveness and manipulation that would confirm the necessity of proceeding with legal action. Claire's voice when she spoke was subdued in a way I had rarely heard from her, lacking the usual animated quality that characterized her communication style even during difficult conversations. She began by saying that she had received my message and had spent the past day and a half thinking about everything that had happened and about what she wanted to say in response. She acknowledged that her initial reaction to my message had been anger and defensiveness, that she had drafted multiple responses attacking me for threatening legal action over what she wanted to characterize as a family disagreement that should be handled privately. But she said that after sitting with those feelings and forcing herself to really consider what I had written, she had come to recognize that her anger was primarily directed at herself for having created a situation where legal consequences were even being discussed. I listened without interrupting, trying to assess whether what I was hearing represented genuine self-awareness or strategic positioning designed to avoid the consequences I had threatened. Claire continued by saying that she had not fully understood during the confrontation at our parents' house how much damage her actions had actually caused or how many people beyond just Marcus and me had been affected by the deletion of the guest list. She said that she had been so focused on her own pain and jealousy that she had not allowed herself to think about the guests who deserved to receive invitations or about the community of people who wanted to celebrate with us. She said that framing her actions as just deleting data from a computer system had allowed her to avoid confronting the reality that she had tried to exclude people from an important life event because she could not manage her own difficult emotions appropriately. Claire said that she wanted to take responsibility for what she had done and wanted to discuss what I needed from her in order to move forward without involving law enforcement or attorneys. She asked whether I would be willing to meet with her in person to have a conversation about accountability and repair, suggesting that communicating by phone or text was not adequate for the seriousness of the situation we were dealing with. She proposed meeting at a neutral location rather than at either of our homes or at our parents' house, somewhere we could talk without the emotional weight of family history and dynamics influencing the conversation. The request for an in-person meeting felt both reasonable and potentially risky. Meeting face-to-face would allow me to better assess whether Claire's expressed remorse was genuine by observing her body language and emotional reactions that were impossible to evaluate accurately through phone or written communication. It would create space for a more substantive conversation than could occur through the limited medium of text or even extended phone calls. But it also created the possibility that Claire would use the meeting to manipulate me emotionally in ways that would be more difficult to resist in person than at a distance, that she would cry or express vulnerability in calculated ways designed to generate sympathy and soften my resolve about requiring serious consequences. I told Claire that I was willing to meet with her, but that I had specific conditions for that meeting that were non-negotiable. First, Marcus would attend with me because this situation affected him as much as it affected me, and because I wanted a witness to whatever was discussed and agreed upon. Second, the meeting would need to occur within the next 2 days so that we did not lose additional time that should be spent on wedding planning rather than on managing the crisis she had created. Third, I expected her to come prepared with concrete proposals for how she intended to repair the damage she had caused, rather than expecting me to dictate terms that she would then negotiate or resist. Fourth, anything we discussed in the meeting would be documented in writing afterward and would be enforceable through the legal mechanisms my attorney had prepared if Claire failed to follow through on commitments she made. Claire agreed to these conditions without hesitation, which surprised me and increased my tentative hope that perhaps she was actually ready to engage in genuine accountability rather than in performance designed to avoid consequences. We arranged to meet on Wednesday evening at a coffee shop in the University District that was roughly equidistant from both our locations and that offered private seating areas where we could talk without being overheard by other patrons. Claire said she would spend Tuesday evening and Wednesday preparing for the conversation and thinking carefully about what specific actions she could take to demonstrate her commitment to making things right. We ended the call with an awkward exchange of goodbyes that carried none of the casual warmth that had characterized our communication before the sabotage had destroyed whatever sisterly affection had existed between us. I immediately called Marcus to tell him about the conversation with Claire and to confirm that he would be able to attend the meeting on Wednesday evening. Marcus agreed without hesitation and said that he thought Claire's willingness to meet and her acknowledgement of having caused harm that extended beyond just the two of us were positive signs that she might be genuinely ready to take responsibility. He cautioned me against assuming the best based on one phone call, but also encouraged me to approach the meeting with openness to the possibility that Claire could surprise me with authentic accountability if I gave her the opportunity to demonstrate it. I also called Catherine Reeves to update her on the development and to ask her advice about how to structure the meeting to maximize the likelihood of reaching an enforceable agreement while also protecting myself from being manipulated into accepting inadequate commitments. Catherine recommended that I prepare a written outline of what I needed from Claire organized into categories of immediate actions, medium-term requirements, and long-term behavioral expectations. She suggested that I bring this outline to the meeting as a starting point for discussion rather than as a rigid set of demands, allowing space for Claire to propose her own ideas about accountability while ensuring that all the essential elements I had identified were addressed in whatever agreement we reached. Catherine also strongly recommended that any agreement reached during the meeting be formalized in a written document that both Claire and I would sign, ideally with witnesses present and with notarization if possible. She explained that verbal agreements were difficult to enforce and that people often remembered or characterized conversations differently when subsequent disputes arose about what had actually been promised. A written agreement with signatures would create a clear record that could be referenced if Claire later claimed that she had been coerced or that she had agreed to different terms than what I believed we had settled on. Catherine offered to draft a template agreement that I could use as a framework for documenting whatever specific commitments emerged from the Wednesday meeting. That evening, I worked on developing the outline Catherine had recommended, organizing my thoughts into the 3 temporal categories she had suggested. The immediate actions category included requirements that Claire needed to complete within days or at most a couple of weeks. These included providing a written apology that acknowledged specifically what she had done and what harm it had caused, posting a public acknowledgement on her social media accounts correcting the misleading narrative she had created through her celebration post, helping to complete any remaining work required to finalize the guest list and vendor coordination, and reimbursing Marcus and me for the additional costs we had incurred because of missed deadlines and rushed arrangements. The medium-term requirements category covered actions that would unfold over the next several months leading up to the wedding and immediately after. These included beginning therapy with a licensed mental health professional who specialized in family dynamics and emotional regulation, with a requirement that she attend at least weekly sessions and provide me with confirmation from the therapist that she was attending and participating meaningfully. I included a requirement that Claire have no direct communication with any of our wedding vendors or with guests on our invitation list unless specifically requested by Marcus or me, establishing a clear boundary that would prevent any future interference. I specified that she would not attend the wedding itself, but that the possibility of attending future family events could be revisited after she had demonstrated sustained commitment to therapy and behavioral change over a minimum 6-month period. The long-term behavioral expectations category addressed patterns that needed to change permanently rather than just in the immediate crisis response period. These included requirements that Claire take responsibility for managing her own emotional reactions to my life circumstances and choices without expecting me to minimize my happiness or hide my successes to protect her feelings. I included expectations that she respect boundaries I set about communication frequency and topics, and that she not use social media to make indirect comments about me or my marriage that could be interpreted as passive-aggressive or undermining. I specified that any future violations of trust or attempts to interfere in my life would result in immediate permanent severance of relationship without opportunity for repair, making clear that this was her one chance to demonstrate that she could maintain appropriate boundaries and treat family members with basic respect. As I worked through this outline, I found myself alternating between hope that the meeting might actually lead to meaningful resolution and cynicism that Claire would agree to whatever was necessary to avoid legal consequences and would then gradually fail to follow through once the immediate crisis had passed. I tried to structure the requirements in ways that would create accountability mechanisms that did not depend entirely on my monitoring her compliance or on my willingness to continually enforce consequences for violations. The therapy requirement with therapist confirmation was one such mechanism, creating external accountability that did not rely on family dynamics or on my personal relationship with Claire. Marcus reviewed my outline when he came home that evening and suggested several modifications that strengthened the enforceability and clarity of various requirements. He recommended that we specify dollar amounts for reimbursement of costs rather than leaving it vague, to avoid future disputes about what expenses were actually attributable to Claire's sabotage versus normal wedding planning adjustments. He suggested that the social media acknowledgement include specific minimum content that Claire needed to address, preventing her from posting something technically compliant but misleadingly vague. He proposed that we include a provision requiring Claire to notify us immediately if she was unable to maintain her therapy commitment for any reason, giving us the opportunity to address compliance issues before they became larger patterns of avoidance. Wednesday morning I woke with a mixture of anticipation and dread about the evening meeting, uncertain whether I would leave the coffee shop with a resolution that allowed me to finally move forward with wedding planning without the constant background stress of unresolved family conflict, or whether I would leave having confirmed that legal action was the only viable path forward. I tried to maintain normal routines at work but found concentration difficult as my mind repeatedly rehearsed different scenarios for how the conversation with Claire might unfold and how I would respond to various approaches she might take. Marcus met me at our apartment after work so we could travel together to the coffee shop, arriving 15 minutes before the scheduled meeting time to claim a quiet corner seating area with comfortable chairs arranged around a small table. I ordered tea that I did not particularly want, but that gave me something to do with my hands during what promised to be an emotionally intense conversation. Marcus got coffee and we sat together reviewing my outline one final time and discussing our strategy for keeping the conversation focused and productive rather than allowing it to devolve into emotional arguments about past hurts or family dynamics. Claire arrived exactly on time, which struck me as significant given her pattern of strategic lateness during the family confrontation at our parents' house. She looked tired in a way that suggested she had not been sleeping well, and her usual careful attention to appearance seemed diminished with minimal makeup and hair pulled back simply rather than styled. She carried a leather portfolio that suggested she had prepared materials for the meeting as I had requested. She greeted both Marcus and me quietly and sat down across from us, her body language conveying a seriousness and humility that was markedly different from her usual confident presentation. Claire began the conversation by thanking us for being willing to meet with her, and by acknowledging that she had no right to expect our time or consideration given what she had done. She said that she had spent the past 2 days engaged in difficult self-examination and had come to understand that her actions over the past several months reflected patterns of behavior and thinking that had been problems in other areas of her life as well, not just in relation to my wedding. She said that she had sabotaged previous relationships when they became too serious because she was afraid of commitment and vulnerability, and that she had left jobs when conflicts arose because she could not handle direct confrontation or accountability. She said that deleting my wedding guest list had been the most serious manifestation of these patterns, but that it had forced her to confront issues she had been avoiding for years. I listened to this self-awareness with cautious optimism, recognizing that Claire had apparently done genuine reflection rather than just preparing tactical responses designed to manipulate me into forgiveness. She continued by opening her portfolio and pulling out several handwritten pages that she said represented her thoughts about what accountability should look like and what specific actions she needed to take to repair the damage she had caused. She handed the pages to me and waited silently while I read through what she had written. Claire's document was remarkably comprehensive and addressed most of the categories I had outlined in my own preparation, though with some different specific proposals that suggested she had thought independently about what would constitute meaningful accountability rather than simply trying to anticipate what I would demand. She proposed writing individual apology letters to various people who had been affected by her actions beyond just Marcus and me, including my parents who had been put in a painful position by her behavior and specific friends of mine whose names she remembered having deleted from the guest list. She suggested making a financial contribution to a charity focused on mental health awareness as a way of acknowledging that her actions had stemmed from untreated emotional and psychological issues that she was now committing to address. The therapy commitment in Claire's proposal went beyond what I had planned to require, including not just weekly individual therapy but also participation in a support group for people dealing with jealousy and resentment issues within family relationships. She proposed providing me with monthly written updates about her progress in therapy and about insights she was gaining into the patterns of thinking that had led to her destructive behavior, creating ongoing transparency rather than just confirming attendance. She acknowledged that she should not attend the wedding and said that she understood it might be years before I would be comfortable having her participate in significant family events, accepting that timeline without trying to negotiate a faster path back to inclusion. The social media component of Claire's proposal was particularly striking because she suggested not just a single corrective post but an ongoing commitment to use her platform to discuss mental health struggles and toxic thought patterns in ways that might help her followers who were dealing with similar issues. She said that her social media presence had been carefully curated to project an image of effortless success and happiness that was fundamentally dishonest about the reality of her life, and that she wanted to use the platform more authentically going forward, even though that meant acknowledging vulnerabilities and failures that she had previously hidden. She included draft text for an initial post that directly addressed her interference with my wedding planning and that took full responsibility without minimization or excuses. As I finished reading Claire's proposals, I found myself surprised by the depth of thought evident in what she had prepared and by her willingness to commit to requirements that were more demanding than what I had planned to ask for. Marcus was reading over my shoulder, and I could sense his similar reaction to the comprehensiveness of what Claire had outlined. I looked up at my sister and saw genuine vulnerability in her expression, an openness to judgment and consequence that seemed markedly different from her usual defensive self-protection. I told Claire that her proposals addressed most of what I believed accountability needed to include, and that I appreciated the seriousness with which she had approached preparing for this meeting. I also told her that good intentions and initial commitments were important, but that what ultimately mattered was sustained follow-through over time, and that I needed to see evidence of real change rather than just promises before I would be willing to rebuild trust or relationship. I explained that I had consulted with an attorney and had learned that her actions could potentially constitute criminal violations and definitely constituted civil wrongs, and that while I preferred to resolve the situation through direct accountability as we were attempting to do, I would not hesitate to pursue legal remedies if she failed to maintain her commitments. Claire nodded and said that she understood the gravity of the situation and understood that she had used up whatever benefit of the doubt she might once have been entitled to through our family relationship. She asked what additional requirements I needed to include beyond what she had proposed and how I wanted to structure ongoing accountability mechanisms. I pulled out my own outline and walked through the specific elements I had identified, noting where her proposals aligned with mine and where there were differences that we needed to discuss and resolve. We spent the next 2 hours working through details and negotiating specific language and timelines for various commitments. Marcus participated actively in the discussion, asking clarifying questions and proposing modifications that would strengthen enforceability or that would address potential loopholes in how requirements were articulated. Claire engaged with the process seriously and accepted most suggestions without resistance, pushing back only on a few points where she felt the requirements as initially stated would be impossible to comply with given practical constraints of her work schedule or financial situation. By the end of the evening, we had reached agreement on a comprehensive accountability framework that incorporated elements from both Claire's proposals and my requirements. The agreement specified that Claire would complete the written apology and the social media acknowledgement within 1 week. She would provide documentation of her first therapy session within 2 weeks and would continue providing monthly confirmation of ongoing participation. She would reimburse us for documented additional costs within 30 days, with a payment plan if necessary to make the amount manageable given her financial situation. She would have no direct contact with wedding vendors or guests except as specifically authorized by us, and she would not attend the wedding itself or any pre-wedding events. She would provide monthly written updates about her therapy progress for at least 6 months, after which we could reassess what ongoing communication and accountability looked like. The agreement also included provisions specifying that any violation of these terms would result in immediate termination of the agreement and pursuit of legal remedies without further warning or opportunity for correction. Claire would sign a formal document incorporating all these terms and would have that document notarized, creating a legally enforceable contract that could be used in civil court if necessary. She agreed to these enforcement mechanisms without hesitation, saying that she understood why trust needed to be rebuilt through demonstrated reliability rather than through her assurances of good intentions. As we prepared to leave the coffee shop, Claire asked whether there was any possibility that our relationship could eventually be repaired or whether I viewed this accountability process as simply managing the logistics of permanent estrangement. I told her honestly that I did not know what the future of our relationship would look like and that the answer depended entirely on whether she maintained her commitments and demonstrated real change over sustained time. I said that I was open to the possibility of eventual reconciliation, but that such an outcome would require years of consistent behavior rather than months, and that she needed to focus on doing the work of addressing her underlying issues rather than on achieving a specific relationship outcome with me. Claire accepted this uncertainty with visible sadness but also with what appeared to be genuine understanding that she had destroyed trust that could not be quickly or easily rebuilt. We agreed to meet again in 1 week after she had completed the initial requirements of written apology and social media acknowledgement, at which point we would sign the formal agreement document that Catherine would prepare incorporating the terms we had negotiated. Claire thanked us again for giving her the opportunity to take responsibility and to work toward making things right, and we parted with awkward goodbyes that acknowledged both the progress represented by the evening's conversation and the vast distance that still existed between current reality and anything that might be characterized as a healthy sisterly relationship. The week following my meeting with Claire brought a deceptive sense of progress that temporarily eased the constant tension I had been carrying since discovering the deleted guest list. Claire completed the written apology within 3 days, sending me a thoughtfully composed letter that acknowledged the specific harms her actions had caused and that took responsibility without attempting to excuse her behavior through references to her own struggles or difficult emotions. She sent similar personalized letters to my parents and to Marcus, each one tailored to acknowledge how her sabotage had affected that particular person rather than using generic language that could have been copied and pasted across multiple recipients. The social media acknowledgement appeared on Claire's Instagram account on Thursday evening, posted during prime engagement hours when her substantial follower base would be most likely to see and interact with the content. The post included a photograph of Claire looking directly at the camera with no filters or flattering angles, her expression serious and her styling deliberately understated in contrast to the carefully curated glamour that characterized her usual content. The caption was lengthy and specific, explaining that she had deliberately interfered with her sister's wedding planning out of jealousy and resentment, that she had deleted important data and had celebrated that sabotage publicly through previous posts that had misrepresented the situation, and that she was now taking full responsibility for her actions and was seeking professional help to address the underlying issues that had driven such destructive behavior. The post generated immediate and intense reaction from Claire's followers, with hundreds of comments appearing within the first few hours expressing shock, disappointment, support, criticism, and various other responses to her public confession. Some commenters praised her courage in acknowledging her mistakes so transparently and in being vulnerable about her struggles with mental health and toxic thought patterns. Others expressed anger at her actions and questioned whether a public apology was sufficient accountability for deliberately trying to ruin someone's wedding. Several people shared their own experiences with family jealousy and sabotage, creating threads of conversation that extended far beyond just reactions to Claire's specific situation. I watched this social media response unfold with complex feelings about the public nature of accountability that I had required as part of our agreement. On one hand, The visibility of Claire's acknowledgments served the purpose I had intended by correcting the misleading narrative she had created and by making clear to her substantial audience that her previous celebration posts had been about harmful behavior rather than about legitimate life improvements. On the other hand, the intensity of public judgment and the permanent nature of the internet record meant that Claire would be dealing with consequences of this disclosure for years into the future in ways that extended beyond what I had specifically intended when structuring the accountability framework. Marcus pointed out that Claire had agreed to these terms voluntarily and with full understanding of what public acknowledgement would entail, and that feeling sympathy for the discomfort she was now experiencing should not lead me to second-guess the appropriateness of requiring this form of accountability. He reminded me that Claire had used social media strategically to construct false narratives and to celebrate behavior that had caused real harm, and that using the same platform to correct those narratives was both fair and necessary regardless of how uncomfortable the experience might be for her. His perspective helped me maintain clarity about the distinction between compassion for Claire's current distress and acceptance of inadequate consequences that would fail to address the seriousness of what she had done. Claire provided documentation of her first therapy appointment on Friday afternoon, forwarding me an email from a licensed clinical psychologist confirming that Claire had attended an initial session and had scheduled weekly appointments for the foreseeable future. The therapist's email included language about confidentiality and appropriate boundaries in third-party communication about treatment, making clear that while she could confirm attendance and participation, she could not and would not share details about session content or about Claire's progress without violating professional ethics. I appreciated this boundary setting because it indicated that Claire had selected a competent professional who understood how to balance accountability requirements with patient privacy rights. By Saturday morning, all the immediate requirements from our agreement had been completed within the specified timelines. Catherine had drafted the formal agreement document incorporating the terms we had negotiated at the coffee shop meeting, and we had arranged to meet on Saturday afternoon at Catherine's office to review and sign the document with proper witnesses and notarization. I felt cautiously optimistic that perhaps the resolution process would unfold more smoothly than I had anticipated, and that Claire's apparently genuine commitment to accountability would be sustained over the longer-term requirements that extended through the coming months. That optimism proved to be premature. Saturday morning brought a phone call from my mother that immediately signaled problems I had not anticipated. Mom's voice was strained and upset as she explained that she had received multiple calls over the past 2 days from extended family members who had seen Claire's Instagram post and who were now demanding to know what had happened and why they had not been informed about such a serious family conflict. Some of these relatives were taking Claire's side and criticizing me for forcing her to make such a humiliating public confession. Others were expressing shock that our family had internal conflicts serious enough to warrant involving attorneys and formal agreements, questioning what kind of family dynamic we had created where siblings could not work through disagreements privately without resorting to legal mechanisms. Mom said that she and Dad were being put in an impossible position of having to explain a situation they did not fully understand themselves and having to defend choices I had made that they had reluctantly accepted but did not necessarily agree with. She said that several relatives had indicated they were reconsidering whether to attend the wedding given the family drama and the apparent dysfunction revealed by Claire's public post. She asked whether I had considered these broader family implications when requiring Claire to make a social media acknowledgement, and her tone suggested that she felt I had prioritized my own desire for public vindication over the well-being of the family as a whole. The criticism in Mom's voice stung deeply because it indicated that despite her stated support during our conversation about the accountability framework I was implementing, she actually harbored significant reservations about my approach and was now feeling emboldened to express those reservations by the negative reactions from extended family. I recognized the pattern from childhood dynamics where Mom would initially defer to Dad's judgment about discipline and consequences, but would then undermine those decisions through indirect expressions of sympathy for the child being disciplined and through subtle communications that the punishment was excessive or unfairly harsh. I told Mom that I understood the situation was creating discomfort for her and Dad within the extended family, but that the alternative would have been allowing Claire's misleading celebration post to remain as the only public narrative about what had occurred, which would have been fundamentally dishonest and which would have communicated that family members could sabotage each other without consequences as long as they were skilled at managing public perception. I pointed out that relatives who were reconsidering wedding attendance based on Claire's acknowledgement post were revealing their own values about what mattered more to them, surface harmony or truth and accountability, and that while I would be sad to lose their presence at the celebration, I would not compromise on requiring honesty to preserve appearances. Mom responded that I was being self-righteous and was prioritizing abstract principles over concrete relationships with people who had been part of my life since childhood. She said that family was supposed to mean accepting people with all their flaws and working through conflicts privately rather than exposing each other's failures to public judgment. She suggested that perhaps I should ask Claire to delete or modify the Instagram post to reduce the damage to our family's reputation and to preserve relationships with extended relatives who were offended by the public airing of private conflicts. I felt anger rising at Mom's suggestion that I should now modify the accountability requirements that Claire had already fulfilled simply because those requirements were creating social discomfort that Mom had not anticipated or had not taken seriously when initially agreeing to support my approach. I told Mom firmly that Claire and I had reached an agreement that she had complied with and that I would not be changing terms retroactively because extended family members who had not been involved in the situation were now expressing opinions about how it should have been handled. I said that if relatives wanted to discuss the situation with me directly, I was willing to have those conversations, but that I would not be managing Mom's discomfort by undermining the accountability framework that had been carefully negotiated and formally agreed upon. The conversation with Mom ended tensely, with both of us frustrated by what felt like the other's unwillingness to understand legitimate concerns. I called Dad separately to get his perspective on the extended family response and to see whether he shared Mom's view that I should consider modifying the social media requirement. Dad was more measured in his response but acknowledged that the public nature of Claire's acknowledgement had created complications he had not fully anticipated when agreeing to support the accountability framework. He said that several of his siblings had contacted him expressing concern about what they perceived as my vindictiveness toward Claire and questioning whether legal involvement was really necessary for what they saw as a family disagreement that should have been resolved through conversation and forgiveness. Dad said that he personally still believed I had the right to determine what consequences were appropriate for Claire's actions and that he was not asking me to change anything about the agreement we had reached. However, he wanted me to understand that there would be ongoing social costs within the extended family that would affect not just my relationships but also his and Mom's relationships with siblings and cousins who felt strongly that I had handled the situation inappropriately. He said that some relatives were planning to decline wedding invitations specifically as a statement of disapproval about how the conflict had been managed, and that this outcome would create lasting tensions at future family gatherings that extended far beyond just the immediate situation with Claire. I appreciated Dad's willingness to be honest about the complications while still respecting my autonomy to make my own decisions about accountability and consequences. His approach contrasted sharply with Mom's attempt to pressure me into changing course through expressions of distress and suggestions that I was damaging the family through excessive harshness. I told Dad that I understood there would be social costs and that I accepted responsibility for those costs as a necessary consequence of refusing to enable destructive behavior through prioritizing appearance over substance. I said that relatives who chose to skip my wedding to express solidarity with Claire or disapproval of my handling of the situation were making their values clear, and that while their absence would be disappointing, it would also clarify which family relationships were based on genuine connection versus superficial social obligation. The extended family backlash intensified over the following days as Claire's Instagram post continued to circulate and generate discussion not just among her followers but within our family network. My Aunt Patricia, Dad's older sister who had always been a dominant personality in family dynamics, called me directly on Sunday evening to express her disappointment in how I had handled the situation with Claire. Patricia had not been particularly close to me throughout my life, but she had always been protective of Claire in ways that suggested she identified with Claire's position as the younger sibling who sometimes felt overshadowed by an older sister's more conventional success. Patricia told me that she had spoken with Claire at length after seeing the Instagram post and that Claire was devastated by the public humiliation and by the permanent damage to her professional reputation that would result from having acknowledged such serious misconduct on a platform where potential employers and professional contacts could easily discover the information. Patricia said that while Claire had made mistakes, my response had been disproportionate and cruel, designed more to punish than to achieve genuine accountability or repair. She said that truly forgiving family members did not require public confessions and legal agreements but rather worked through conflicts privately with compassion for each other's weaknesses and struggles. I listened to Patricia's criticism with increasing frustration at her presumption that she understood the situation adequately based on conversations with Claire and on her own interpretation of the Instagram post. I explained to Patricia that she had not been present for months of wedding planning sabotage, had not discovered evidence of deliberate data destruction, had not sat through Claire's initial denial and manipulation during the family confrontation, and was therefore not in a position to judge whether my response was proportionate to the actual harm caused. I told her that Claire had agreed voluntarily to every term in our accountability framework, including the social media acknowledgement, and that characterizing Claire as a victim of my cruelty ignored her agency and her own assessment that public acknowledgement was appropriate given the public nature of her previous celebration posts. Patricia dismissed my explanations and said that I had always been rigid and unforgiving, unable to accept that people made mistakes and needed grace rather than judgment. She said that my wedding would be diminished by the family divisions I had created through my handling of this situation, and that I would look back with regret on having prioritized being right over maintaining family unity. She informed me that she would not be attending the wedding and that several of her children who were also invited would likely make the same decision in solidarity with her position. She ended the call by saying that she hoped I would eventually mature enough to understand that family relationships required compromise and acceptance rather than rigid adherence to abstract principles of accountability. The conversation with Patricia left me shaken and doubting myself in ways that the initial crisis with Claire had not. Claire's sabotage had been clearly wrong, and her initial defensiveness had made it easy to maintain clarity about the need for consequences. But the extended family response was more ambiguous and complicated, involving people whose judgment I generally respected and who were not directly involved in the original conflict but who nonetheless had strong opinions about how I should have handled the situation. The suggestion that I was rigid and unforgiving touched on insecurities I had carried since childhood about being the responsible older sibling who struggled to be spontaneous or to overlook rules and standards that others found unnecessarily constraining. Marcus found me that evening sitting alone in our darkened living room processing the conversation with Patricia and the broader realization that the accountability framework I had implemented with Claire was creating cascading consequences throughout my extended family that would affect relationships and dynamics for years into the future. He sat beside me and asked what I was thinking about, and I shared honestly that I was questioning whether I had been too rigid in my requirements and whether the social costs of the approach I had chosen were proportionate to what I had gained through Claire's accountability. Marcus listened carefully and then asked me a question that helped clarify my thinking. He asked whether I believed that what Claire had done was wrong and deserved serious consequences, or whether I now thought that my initial reaction had been an overreaction driven by emotion rather than by accurate assessment of harm. When I said that I absolutely believed Claire's actions had been seriously wrong and had deserved meaningful consequences, Marcus pointed out that the extended family criticism was not actually about whether my assessment of Claire's behavior was correct, but rather about competing values regarding how to handle wrongdoing within family systems. Marcus explained that some people and some family cultures believed that maintaining surface harmony and keeping conflicts private was more important than implementing accountability that might disrupt relationships or create discomfort. Other people and family cultures believed that genuine health and integrity required addressing wrongdoing directly even when doing so created short-term conflict or social costs. Neither approach was objectively correct in all circumstances, but they represented fundamentally different philosophies about what family loyalty meant and what kinds of behavior should be tolerated in the name of preserving relationships. He pointed out that the relatives criticizing my approach were operating from the first philosophy and were genuinely convinced that I was damaging the family through excessive rigidity and unwillingness to forgive privately. But their conviction did not make their assessment correct or mean that I needed to abandon my own values to conform to their expectations. He reminded me that I had thought carefully about what accountability needed to look like, had consulted with legal and therapeutic professionals about appropriate frameworks, had given Claire opportunities to engage voluntarily rather than imposing consequences unilaterally, and had maintained my commitments even when doing so was uncomfortable or socially costly. Marcus's perspective helped me recognize that the extended family backlash, while genuinely painful, did not actually constitute evidence that I had made wrong choices about how to handle Claire's sabotage. The discomfort I was experiencing was the predictable result of choosing values that differed from those held by some family members, not evidence that my values were flawed or that my implementation of consequences had been excessive. Understanding this distinction did not eliminate the pain of damaged relationships or the disappointment of relatives declining wedding invitations, but it did help me maintain confidence that I was acting with integrity rather than allowing social pressure to erode commitments I had made for sound reasons. The situation deteriorated further when Claire herself called me on Monday evening, clearly distressed and asking whether we could modify the terms of our agreement to address what she characterized as unintended consequences that were affecting her more severely than either of us had anticipated. Claire explained that the Instagram post had been discovered by her employer through routine social media monitoring that the marketing agency conducted for all employees whose personal accounts were connected to their professional identity. Her supervisor had called her into a meeting to discuss the post and had expressed serious concern about whether someone who acknowledged deliberately sabotaging family relationships and destroying data could be trusted in a role that involved managing client accounts and confidential business information. Claire said that she was not being fired immediately, but was being placed on performance review status where her work would be monitored more closely and where any additional concerns about judgment or reliability could result in termination. She said that several colleagues who had previously been friendly had become distant, and that she was hearing through unofficial channels that people in the office were discussing her situation and questioning her character. She explained that she had not anticipated these professional consequences when agreeing to the social media acknowledgement requirement, and that the ongoing damage to her career and professional reputation seemed disproportionate to what the accountability framework had been designed to achieve. Claire asked whether I would be willing to allow her to modify the Instagram post to make it less specific about what she had done, perhaps removing references to deliberately deleting data and instead using vaguer language about interfering with wedding planning in ways she now regretted. She suggested that the core accountability of public acknowledgement could be maintained while reducing the professional damage by making the post less dramatic and less suggestive of serious character flaws that would concern employers. She said that she understood why I had wanted clear and specific acknowledgement, but that neither of us had intended for her to lose her job or to have her professional reputation permanently damaged in ways that would affect her career trajectory for years into the future. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.